Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Taking a keen interest in village affairs precedes you, and this particular affair has aspects that I believe will intrigue your analytical mind. Miss Marple settled herself in the comfortable chair that Dr. Haydock indicated, noting the carefully arranged papers on his desk and the unmistakable air of a man who had reached conclusions he would prefer not to have reached. In her considerable experience with medical practitioners, she had observed that they possessed a particular gravity when dealing with cases that extended beyond the realm of natural causes. "I have completed my preliminary examination of poor Mrs. Hartwell," Dr. Haydock continued, his tone carrying the professional detachment that physicians employed when discussing matters of life and death. "The results, I'm afraid, confirm what I suspected at the scene yesterday. Mrs. Hartwell died from cyanide poisoning, administered in sufficient quantity to ensure rapid and irreversible effects." Miss Marple received this intelligence with the calm attention of someone who had suspected as much from the moment she detected the characteristic scent of bitter almonds. Cyanide represented a poison of particular efficiency, chosen by those who wished to ensure their victim had no opportunity for recovery or revelation. "The concentration was quite remarkable," Dr. Haydock observed, consulting his notes with professional precision, "far greater than would have been required merely to incapacitate. This suggests either considerable knowledge of the substance's properties or a determination to leave nothing to chance." Miss Marple reflected that both possibilities pointed towards someone with access to specialized information, rather than the sort of crime of passion that might be committed by an individual acting purely on impulse. The careful calculation required to obtain and administer such a dose indicated planning of a most deliberate nature. "I wonder, Doctor, whether you might venture an opinion regarding the method of administration?" Miss Marple inquired delicately. "The symptoms appeared shortly after Mrs. Hartwell consumed that portion of Victoria's sponge." Dr. Haydock nodded gravely. "Indeed, the timing suggests the poison was incorporated into the almond flavoring of the cake. Cyanide possesses a bitter almond taste that would be easily masked by genuine almond extract, particularly in a rich sponge cake where such flavoring would be entirely expected." This revelation confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions regarding the anonymous donation. Someone had deliberately prepared a poisoned cake, knowing that Mrs. Hartwell's well-established fondness for sampling the Bazaar's offerings would ensure she became its victim. The precision of the plan suggested intimate knowledge of both Mrs. Hartwell's habits and the procedures of the church bazaar. "Inspector Slack has been most thorough in his preliminary investigations," Dr. Haydock continued. "He has established that several individuals had access to the parish hall where the cake donations were stored overnight. The building is secured, but keys are held by various members of the church committee in case of emergencies." Miss Marple made mental note of this intelligence, wondering which members of their small community possessed such access, and whether Inspector Slack had yet considered the full implications of Mrs. Hartwell's financial investigations. In her experience, murders rarely occurred in isolation from their broader context, and the timing of Mrs. Hartwell's death seemed rather too convenient to be mere coincidence. "There is another matter that may prove significant," Dr. Haydock added, lowering his voice with the discretion of someone accustomed to maintaining medical confidences. "The particular form of cyanide used in this case appears to be of a type commonly employed in photographic developing processes. It is not a substance readily available to the general public, suggesting our perpetrator either possessed specialized knowledge or had access to professional supplies." This intelligence struck Miss Marple as particularly illuminating. Photography remained something of a specialized pursuit in St. Mary Mead, practiced by only a few enthusiasts who maintain their own dark rooms and chemical supplies. The field of potential suspects had suddenly narrowed considerably. "I don't suppose," Miss Marple ventured carefully, "that you might be aware of which members of our community pursue photography as a hobby?" Dr. Haydock considered this question with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to making accurate diagnoses based on limited evidence. Mr. Blackwood, the church treasurer, has long maintained a darkroom in his cottage. He often photographs church events and has developed quite a reputation for his portraits of the annual flower show. There may be others, of course, but his involvement with church affairs would certainly have provided opportunity. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing interest, reflecting that Mr. Blackwood's nervous behaviour at the bazaar now assumed a more sinister significance. His frequent consultation of his pocket watch suggested someone anticipating a specific event, whilst his position as church treasurer would certainly have provided access to the financial records that had so concerned Mrs. Hartwell. Has Inspector Slack considered the possibility that Mrs. Hartwell's death might be connected to her investigation of the church accounts? Miss Marple inquired. Dr. Haydock raised his eyebrows with the expression of someone encountering an unexpected but logical connection. "I confess that aspect had not occurred to me, though now that you mention it, the timing does seem rather suggestive. Mrs. Hartwell was not generally regarded as having enemies, yet someone clearly felt sufficiently threatened by her continued existence to resort to murder." Miss Marple reflected that financial irregularities provided one of the most compelling motives for homicide, particularly when discovery threatened not merely financial ruin, but complete social disgrace. In a community such as St. Mary Mead, reputation represented a currency more valuable than mere money, and its loss could prove devastating to those who had built their lives upon foundations of respectability. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose brisk knock and subsequent entrance suggested matters of considerable urgency. The inspector's expression bore the particular combination of determination and frustration that Miss Marple had observed in other officials when faced with crimes that appeared straightforward on the surface, but revealed increasing complexity upon closer examination. Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple, Inspector Slack acknowledged them with professional courtesy, before consulting his notebook with the manner of someone checking details of considerable importance. "I have been conducting interviews with the various people who had access to the parish hall, and I'm afraid the situation is rather more complicated than initially appeared." Miss Marple waited with the patience of someone accustomed to allowing investigations to unfold at their natural pace, whilst Dr. Haydock maintained the attentive silence of a professional colleague. "It appears that no fewer than 7 individuals possessed keys to the parish hall," Inspector Slack continued. "The vicar, naturally, along with his wife, the church treasurer, Mr. Blackwood, the organist, Miss Pemberton, the head of the Women's Institute, Mrs. Foster, the verger, Mr. Dane, and the church warden, Colonel Melchett." Miss Marple observed that this list encompassed virtually every person of significance in the church community, a circumstance that rendered the investigation considerably more challenging, while simultaneously suggesting that the murderer had planned their crime with full knowledge of these access arrangements. Furthermore, Inspector Slack added with evident frustration, several of these individuals visited the parish hall on the evening before the bazaar, ostensibly to make final preparations or to deliver last-minute contributions. Establishing precise timelines has proved somewhat difficult, as people seem uncertain about exact times and durations. This intelligence did not surprise Miss Marple, who had observed that witnesses to significant events often possess remarkably imprecise memories when questioned afterwards, a phenomenon that seemed to worsen in direct proportion to the gravity of the circumstances under investigation. "However," Inspector Slack continued with renewed determination, "I have established that the poisoned cake was delivered sometime between 8 and 10 o'clock on the evening before the bazaar, left with other anonymous contributions in the kitchen area of the parish hall." Miss Marple reflected that this time frame suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous action, a conclusion that reinforced her growing conviction that Mrs. Hartwell's murder had been motivated by something far more substantial than mere personal dislike. Chapter 4. The Mysterious Donation. The afternoon had settled into that particular quality of golden stillness which characterized September days in St. Mary Mead, when summer's urgency had given way to autumn's more contemplative pace. Miss Marple, having spent the morning in most illuminating conversation with Dr. Haydock and Inspector Slack, found herself drawn to the parish hall where the tragedy had unfolded. The building stood empty now, its windows reflecting the declining sun with the blank stare of a house temporarily abandoned by life. Mrs. Foster, the stalwart head of the Women's Institute, was emerging from the hall as Miss Marple approached, her arms laden with the folding chairs and trestle tables that formed the infrastructure of village social life. Mrs. Foster possessed that particular combination of efficiency and discretion that made her an invaluable repository of community knowledge, and Miss Marple had long recognized the wisdom of consulting such individuals when seeking to understand the undercurrents of village affairs. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Foster called out, setting down her burden with evident relief. "How providential! I was hoping to encounter someone with whom I might discuss this dreadful business. The whole affair has left us quite at sixes and sevens, as you might imagine." Miss Marple approached with the measured pace of someone who understood that haste often proved counterproductive when encouraging confidences. Mrs. Foster had the appearance of someone bursting with information yet uncertain of the propriety of sharing it, a condition that Miss Marple had observed frequently in the aftermath of shocking events. "I've been attempting to make sense of the arrangements for yesterday's donations," Mrs. Foster continued, glancing about as though to ensure their privacy. "As you know, we've always encouraged anonymous contributions to our church events, believing that charity should be modest and unassuming. However, this particular tradition may have provided rather more opportunity for mischief than we anticipated." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, noting the troubled expression that accompanied Mrs. Foster's words. In her considerable experience, traditions established with the best of intentions sometimes created circumstances that the well-meaning founders had never envisaged. "The matter that particularly concerns me," Mrs. Foster went on, lowering her voice with the discretion of someone sharing intelligence of considerable delicacy, "involves the pattern of anonymous donations we've been receiving over the past 6 months. They've been quite substantial, far beyond what we might normally expect from individual parishioners." This revelation struck Miss Marple as potentially significant, suggesting that someone had been making unusually generous contributions to church activities during precisely the period when Mrs. Hartwell had been conducting her financial investigations. The timing seemed rather too convenient to represent mere coincidence. "The donations have arrived monthly, always in cash, always accompanied by a simple card signed 'A Friend of the Parish,'" Mrs. Foster continued. "The amounts have varied, but never less than £10, sometimes as much as 20. For a village of our size, such generosity is quite remarkable." Miss Marple reflected that £20 represented a substantial sum for most residents of St. Mary Mead, suggesting either considerable personal wealth or, perhaps more pertinently, access to funds that might not be entirely legitimate. The anonymous nature of the donations provided convenient cover for someone seeking to return money that had been obtained through questionable means. "I wonder," Miss Marple inquired delicately, "whether these donations coincided with any particular events in the parish calendar." Mrs. Foster considered this question with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to organizing complex community activities. "Now that you mention it, they did seem to arrive shortly before our quarterly financial reviews. Mrs. Hartwell had instituted a more rigorous system of accounting since her appointment as auditor, and these donations often appeared just when our various funds were being examined." The implications of this pattern were not lost on Miss Marple, who had observed similar arrangements in other contexts where individuals sought to obscure financial irregularities. Anonymous donations provided an excellent method of returning stolen funds, whilst maintaining the appearance of legitimate charitable contributions. "The donations were always delivered at night," Mrs. Foster added, "left in the collection box beside the church door. Father Brown discovered them during his early morning rounds, along with the signed cards expressing gratitude for the parish's spiritual guidance." Miss Marple found herself wondering whether Father Brown had retained these cards, as handwriting often revealed more about its author than the writer intended. Even the most careful attempts at disguise frequently betrayed characteristic patterns of formation and style that could prove illuminating to those trained in such observation. "There's another aspect that may prove relevant," Mrs. Foster continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The timing of these donations appears to have coincided with Mrs. Hartwell's appointment as our new auditor. The first contribution arrived within a week of her taking up the position, which struck me at the time as rather remarkable timing. This intelligence confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicion that the anonymous donations represented an attempt to replace funds that had been improperly diverted from their intended purposes. Someone with access to the church accounts had been systematically stealing charitable contributions, using the anonymous donation system to restore the missing amounts before Mrs. Hartwell's investigation could reveal the full extent of the irregularities. "I confess," Mrs. Foster admitted with evident discomfort, "that I mentioned these donations to Mrs. Hartwell during one of our conversations about the parish finances. She seemed most interested in the pattern, particularly the timing of their arrival." Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Foster's expression suggested she now regretted sharing this information, perhaps recognizing that her innocent observation might have contributed to the chain of events that culminated in Mrs. Hartwell's murder. Such was often the case with tragedies of this nature, where well-intentioned actions created unforeseen consequences. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation, and both women turned to observe Mr. Blackwood walking briskly along the path that led from the village centre to the church. The treasurer's appearance provided an interesting coincidence, given the nature of their discussion, and Miss Marple noted that his usual composed demeanour seemed somewhat strained. "Ladies," Mr. Blackwood acknowledged them with a formal nod, though his eyes held the particular wariness of someone uncertain of his reception. "I trust you're both well, considering the circumstances. These have been most trying times for our entire community." Mrs. Foster responded with the polite reserve that Miss Marple had observed people often employed when uncertain of their companion's potential involvement in questionable activities. The treasurer's presence created an immediate tension, as though his arrival had introduced an element of potential danger into their previously comfortable conversation. "We were discussing the arrangements for yesterday's bazaar," Mrs. Foster replied carefully. "So many details to be sorted out in the aftermath of such a tragic event." Mr. Blackwood's expression tightened slightly, suggesting that he found the topic of the bazaar's organization rather less than welcome. Miss Marple noted the particular way his hands moved restlessly, as though seeking occupation to mask his inner agitation. "Indeed," Mr. Blackwood replied with forced heartiness. "Poor Mrs. Hartwell's death has cast rather a shadow over what should have been a joyous community celebration. One can only hope that Inspector Slack's investigation will soon provide the answers we all seek." Miss Marple observed that Mr. Blackwood's concern for a swift resolution might be motivated by considerations beyond mere community healing. In her experience, those with secrets to conceal often displayed the greatest eagerness for investigations to conclude quickly, preferably with results that avoided uncomfortable scrutiny of their own activities. "The inspector has been most thorough," Miss Marple remarked mildly. "I understand he's been particularly interested in the financial aspects of church administration, given Mrs. Hartwell's recent appointment as auditor." The effect of these words upon Mr. Blackwood was immediate and unmistakable. His colour heightened perceptibly, whilst his hands ceased their restless movement and clenched slightly at his sides. Mrs. Foster glanced between them with the expression of someone sensing undercurrents beyond her immediate comprehension. "Mrs. Hartwell was indeed most conscientious in her duties," Mr. Blackwood replied, his voice carrying a note of strain that had not been present moments before. "Perhaps overly so, one might venture to suggest. She had a tendency to see irregularities where simpler explanations might suffice." This defensive response struck Miss Marple as highly significant, suggesting that Mr. Blackwood had been the subject of Mrs. Hartwell's particular attention. The treasurer's evident discomfort when discussing financial matters reinforced her growing conviction that the church accounts contained secrets worth killing to preserve. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Parish Hall. The evening light possessed that particular quality of amber tranquillity which Miss Marple had always associated with the approach of significant revelations. Having taken her customary constitutional through the village, she found herself drawn once again to the parish hall, where the events of recent days seemed to have left an almost palpable atmosphere of unresolved tension. The building stood silent in the gathering dusk, its windows reflecting the last rays of sunlight with the patient dignity of a structure that had witnessed countless human dramas. Miss Marple had always maintained that buildings, like people, retained the imprint of significant events, and the parish hall seemed to radiate a sense of secrets yet to be uncovered. The many years of observing human nature had taught her that crucial evidence often lay not in what was immediately visible, but in the subtle traces left by those who believed their actions had gone unnoticed. The door yielded to her gentle pressure, revealing the familiar interior now stripped of its festive decorations and returned to its everyday functionality. The cake stall had been dismantled, its cheerful bunting removed, but Miss Marple could still detect the faint scent of vanilla and sugar that lingered in corners, where the afternoon sun had warmed the floorboards. It was here, she reflected, that someone had made their final preparations for murder, confident that their careful planning would mask their deadly intent. Moving with the measured steps of someone accustomed to thorough investigation, Miss Marple began to examine the kitchen area, where the donated cakes had been stored overnight. The room bore all the hallmarks of recent activity, with surfaces wiped clean and utensils returned to their proper places. Yet her experienced eye detected certain anomalies that suggested the presence of someone who had worked here under circumstances rather different from normal food preparation. The larder, a spacious cupboard that served to store non-perishable goods between church events, drew her particular attention. Someone had made an effort to arrange its contents with unusual precision, as though seeking to obscure evidence of recent disturbance. Miss Marple had observed similar behaviour in her nephew Raymond's study. After he had been searching for documents he preferred others not to know he possessed. A thorough examination of the larder's contents revealed several items that struck her as noteworthy. A tin of almond extract, considerably lighter than its neighbours, suggested recent use, whilst a small glass jar that had once contained preserved fruits bore traces of having been hastily cleaned. Most intriguing of all was a fragment of paper wedged beneath the larder's bottom shelf, bearing partial impressions of handwritten text. Miss Marple extracted this evidence with the careful attention of someone who understood the significance of seemingly insignificant details. The paper appeared to be part of a larger document, torn either accidentally or deliberately, and the visible text consisted of figures arranged in columns with what appeared to be dates beside them. The handwriting, though partially obscured, possessed characteristics that suggested familiarity with financial record-keeping. The discovery of this fragment confirmed her growing suspicion that the parish hall had been used for purposes beyond the simple preparation of a poisoned cake. Someone had been conducting clandestine activities here, most likely involving the manipulation of financial records that Mrs. Hartwell's investigation had begun to expose. A soft footstep in the main hall interrupted her contemplation, and Miss Marple moved quietly to the kitchen doorway to observe the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Miss Pemberton, the church organist, had entered through the main door and was examining the space where the cake stall had been positioned, her movements suggesting more than casual interest in the scene of the crime. Miss Marple remained motionless in the kitchen doorway, recognizing that Miss Pemberton's behaviour warranted careful observation. The organist moved about the hall with a systematic thoroughness that reminded Miss Marple of her great-nephew David when he had been searching for evidence of his sister's diary reading. There was something distinctly professional about Miss Pemberton's examination of the premises. After several minutes of careful searching, Miss Pemberton approached the very area where Miss Marple had discovered the fragment of paper. The organist's evident familiarity with the location suggested either remarkable intuition or prior knowledge of what might be found there. Miss Marple watched with growing interest as Miss Pemberton conducted a thorough examination of the larder and its surroundings. "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, stepping into the main hall, "whether you might be searching for something in particular." Miss Pemberton started visibly, her composure momentarily shaken by the unexpected interruption. Her recovery was swift, however, suggesting someone accustomed to maintaining calm under pressure, a quality that Miss Marple found intriguing in someone whose primary occupation involved playing the church organ. "Miss Marple," Miss Pemberton replied, her voice carrying a note of wariness, "I confess you rather startled me. I was simply examining the scene where that poor woman met her end, hoping perhaps to understand how such a terrible thing could have occurred in our peaceful community." Miss Marple noted that Miss Pemberton's explanation, whilst plausible on the surface, failed to account for the systematic nature of her search, or her particular interest in areas unlikely to yield casual insights into Mrs. Hartwell's death. In her considerable experience, people who offered unsolicited explanations for their presence often possessed reasons they preferred not to reveal. "Such a shocking business," Miss Marple agreed amiably. "Though I confess I've been wondering whether Mrs. Hartwell's death might be connected to her recent work as church auditor. Financial irregularities can create such passionate responses in those who find themselves exposed." The effect of these words upon Miss Pemberton was immediate and revealing. Her carefully maintained composure slipped momentarily, revealing an alertness that suggested professional, rather than personal, interest in the investigation's progress. Miss Marple had observed similar reactions in individuals whose involvement in events extended beyond their apparent roles. "I understand Mrs. Hartwell had discovered certain discrepancies in the church accounts," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "Such dedication to accuracy is commendable, though it can sometimes prove inconvenient for those who prefer their activities to remain unexamined." Miss Pemberton's response came after a pause that suggested careful consideration of how much to reveal. Mrs. Hartwell was indeed most thorough in her investigations, perhaps more thorough than some people anticipated when she accepted the position. This oblique acknowledgment of Mrs. Hartwell's discoveries struck Miss Marple as significant, suggesting that Miss Pemberton possessed knowledge of the financial irregularities that had so concerned the deceased auditor. The organist's evident familiarity with the investigation's broader context reinforced Miss Marple's growing conviction that Miss Pemberton's role in recent events extended beyond that of an innocent bystander. "I wonder," Miss Marple ventured delicately, "whether you might have observed anything unusual in the days preceding the bazaar. Someone with access to this hall who seemed particularly interested in the arrangements for cake donations, perhaps." Miss Pemberton's hesitation before responding suggested internal debate regarding how much information to share. When she finally spoke, her words carried the careful precision of someone weighing each revelation for its potential consequences. "I did notice that Mr. Blackwood seemed unusually concerned about the bazaar's organization," Miss Pemberton admitted. "He visited the hall several times in the week before the event, ostensibly to check on preparations, but often remaining after others had departed." This intelligence confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions regarding the church treasurer's behavior, while simultaneously raising questions about Miss Pemberton's own presence during these supposedly private visits. In her experience, witnesses to clandestine activities often possessed their own reasons for being in positions to observe such behavior. "Mr. Blackwood's dedication to church affairs has always been exemplary," Miss Marple observed mildly, "though I understand his recent financial difficulties might have created certain pressures that could affect his judgment." Miss Pemberton's sharp glance suggested that this information was not entirely new to her, reinforcing Miss Marple's impression that the organist possessed knowledge of community affairs that exceeded what one might expect from a recent arrival to the village. Chapter 6. The Organist's Strange Tale. The silence that followed Miss Marple's observation regarding Mr. Blackwood's financial difficulties possessed that particular quality which she had learned to recognize as the prelude to significant revelation. Miss Pemberton stood motionless in the gathering twilight of the parish hall, her expression suggesting someone who had reached the inevitable moment when carefully maintained pretenses must give way to uncomfortable truths. Miss Marple, Miss Pemberton began at length, her voice carrying a note of resignation that had been entirely absent from her previous responses. I believe the time has come for complete honesty regarding my presence in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple waited with the patience of someone who understood that confessions, like delicate flowers, required gentle handling if they were to bloom fully. She had observed that those who carry professional secrets often experience considerable relief when circumstances finally permitted them to speak freely. I am not, strictly speaking, merely the church organist, Miss Pemberton continued, glancing about the empty hall as though to ensure their privacy. My arrival in your village 6 months ago was motivated by concerns rather more serious than a simple desire for rural tranquility. This admission struck Miss Marple as entirely consistent with her growing suspicions regarding Miss Pemberton's unusually keen interest in community affairs. In her considerable experience, people who watched others with professional attention rarely did so without compelling reasons. I am employed by the diocesan authorities as a private investigator, Miss Pemberton revealed, her words carrying the weight of someone unburdening herself of a significant secret. My musical qualifications are genuine, but my primary purpose in accepting the organist position was to conduct a discreet investigation into allegations of financial irregularities within the parish. Miss Marple received this intelligence with the composed attention of someone who had suspected that Miss Pemberton's role extended beyond the playing of hymns and voluntary pieces. The precision of the organist's observations and her evident familiarity with investigative procedures had suggested professional training that exceeded what one might expect from someone whose primary concern was ecclesiastical music. The diocese had received anonymous complaints regarding the management of charitable funds, Miss Pemberton continued, her professional demeanour now fully evident. Suggestions that donations intended for specific purposes were being diverted to other uses, and that the Church's financial records might not accurately reflect the true disposition of contributed funds. This revelation confirmed Miss Marple's growing understanding of the complex circumstances surrounding Mrs. Hartwell's death. The appointment of a diocesan investigator indicated that suspicions regarding the parish finances had extended beyond the local community, attracting attention from ecclesiastical authorities who possessed both the resources and the authority to conduct thorough investigations. My investigation had progressed considerably when Mrs. Hartwell was appointed as the new auditor, Miss Pemberton went on. Initially, I regarded her appointment as potentially beneficial to my work, as her reputation for thoroughness was well established throughout the county. Miss Marple reflected that the convergence of two separate investigations into the same financial irregularities must have created considerable anxiety for whoever was responsible for the missing funds. The prospect of exposure from two different sources would have rendered the situation desperately precarious for the guilty party. Mrs. Hartwell contacted me directly 3 weeks ago, Miss Pemberton revealed, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She had discovered evidence of systematic embezzlement involving multiple church funds, and she was most concerned about the implications for the various charitable causes that had been affected. This intelligence provided crucial insight into the events preceding Mrs. Hartwell's murder, suggesting that her death had been precipitated not merely by her discovery of financial irregularities, but by her decision to share that knowledge with someone in a position to ensure that appropriate action was taken. She had documented evidence of funds being diverted from their intended purposes over a period of several years, Miss Pemberton continued. Money collected for the orphanage, the restoration fund, even the modest amounts contributed for flowers and maintenance had been systematically redirected to personal use. Miss Marple observed that such comprehensive embezzlement represented far more than casual opportunism, suggesting someone with both regular access to church funds and sufficient authority to manipulate the records without immediate detection. The scope of the theft indicated careful planning and considerable nerve. Mrs. Hartwell had identified Mr. Blackwood as the most likely perpetrator, Miss Pemberton admitted with evident reluctance. His position as treasurer provided the necessary access, whilst his recent gambling debts offered a compelling motive for the systematic theft of charitable contributions. This revelation confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions regarding the church treasurer, though she found herself wondering why Miss Pemberton had not acted upon Mrs. Hartwell's discoveries to prevent the tragedy that had subsequently unfolded. I advise Mrs. Hartwell to proceed with extreme caution, Miss Pemberton continued, as though reading Miss Marple's thoughts. Financial crimes of this nature often drive perpetrators to increasingly desperate measures when they perceive themselves to be cornered. Unfortunately, Mrs. Hartwell possessed a forthright nature that was perhaps unsuited to the delicate handling such situations require. Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Hartwell's directness, whilst admirable in many contexts, had indeed proven hazardous when dealing with someone driven to desperation by the prospect of exposure and disgrace. In her experience, those who had built their lives upon foundations of respectability often proved capable of extraordinary violence when their respectability was threatened. She was determined to present her findings to the Church Council immediately after the Bazaar, Miss Pemberton revealed. I attempted to persuade her to coordinate her revelations with my own investigation, thereby ensuring that we possessed sufficient evidence to guarantee successful prosecution. However, she felt that the moral imperative to protect future charitable contributions outweighed any tactical considerations. This intelligence suggested that Mrs. Hartwell's murder had been motivated by the killer's knowledge of her intention to expose the embezzlement publicly, making her death a final, desperate attempt to preserve a secret that could no longer be maintained through conventional means. I had arranged to meet with Mrs. Hartwell on the morning following the Bazaar, Miss Pemberton continued with evident regret. She had promised to provide me with copies of all her evidence, ensuring that the investigation could proceed even if anything happened to compromise her own safety. Miss Marple noted the irony that Mrs. Hartwell's commendable desire to ensure the continuation of the investigation had, in fact, made her murder inevitable. Her killer would have recognized that eliminating Mrs. Hartwell alone would be insufficient if her evidence was to be shared with a professional investigator. The anonymous donations that have appeared over recent months were Mr. Blackwood's attempt to replace the stolen funds before the annual audit, Miss Pemberton explained. However, his gambling debts had grown beyond his capacity to repay, making complete restitution impossible despite his increasingly frantic efforts. This pattern confirmed Miss Marple's understanding of the psychological pressures that had driven Mr. Blackwood to murder. The treasurer had found himself trapped between the demands of his creditors and the approaching exposure of his crimes, with Mrs. Hartwell's investigation serving as the catalyst that transformed financial desperation into homicidal action. I had been searching this hall for evidence that Mr. Blackwood might have overlooked in his haste to eliminate traces of his activities, Miss Pemberton concluded. Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that she had hidden copies of certain documents in locations known only to herself, and I hoped to discover these before they could be destroyed. Miss Marple withdrew the fragment of paper she had discovered earlier, observing Miss Pemberton's expression of recognition and relief as she examined the partial financial records it contained. Chapter 7. A Pattern of Charity. The morning brought with it that crisp clarity of September air which Miss Marple had always found conducive to ordered thought, and she found herself walking through the village with the fragment of evidence safely tucked within her reticule, alongside Miss Pemberton's revelations from the previous evening. The diocesan investigator had departed with promises to coordinate her findings with Inspector Slack, leaving Miss Marple to contemplate the emerging pattern of deception that had culminated in Mrs. Hartwell's untimely death. It was, she reflected, rather like the time her great-nephew had attempted to conceal his examination failures by forging improved marks upon his report, only to discover that each fabrication necessitated further deceptions until the entire edifice collapsed under its own complexity. Mr. Blackwood's financial crimes appeared to follow a similar trajectory, beginning with modest diversions that had gradually expanded into wholesale embezzlement as his gambling debts mounted beyond his capacity for legitimate repayment. Her contemplations were interrupted by the sight of Mrs. Clement emerging from the post office, with the particular expression of distress that Miss Marple had learned to associate with the receipt of unwelcome correspondence. The vicar's wife moved with the uncertain gait of someone whose world had suddenly revealed itself to contain previously unsuspected depths of unpleasantness. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement called out, her voice carrying a note of relief at encountering a sympathetic presence. "How fortuitous to meet you. I've just received the most disturbing communication from the diocesan office regarding our parish finances." Miss Marple approached with the gentle concern of someone prepared to offer both practical assistance and emotional support during trying circumstances. In her considerable experience, official correspondence rarely brought welcome news to those already struggling with the aftermath of scandal and tragedy. "The bishop's secretary has requested a complete audit of all church accounts for the past 5 years," Mrs. Clement continued, her hands trembling slightly as she consulted the formal letter. "They've also indicated that a special investigator has been conducting inquiries into our financial management, though they provide no details regarding the nature or scope of these investigations." This intelligence confirmed Miss Marple's understanding that Miss Pemberton's investigation had reached the attention of the highest diocesan authorities, transforming what had begun as local irregularities into a matter of ecclesiastical concern. Such escalation suggested that the scope of Mr. Blackwood's embezzlement had exceeded even Mrs. Hartwell's comprehensive discoveries. "I confess I find myself quite overwhelmed by the implications," Mrs. Clement admitted with evident distress. "The thought that our charitable efforts may have been compromised by dishonesty strikes at the very heart of our Christian mission." Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Clement's anguish was entirely understandable, as the betrayal of charitable trust represented perhaps the most unconscionable form of theft, robbing not merely the immediate victims but the vulnerable beneficiaries who depended upon such contributions for their welfare. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "we might examine the specific funds that appear to have been affected. Understanding the full extent of the problem often proves the first step toward rectifying the damage that has been done." Mrs. Clement nodded gratefully, leading the way toward the vicarage where the church records were maintained in a study that bore testament to decades of careful administration. The room's oak paneling and leather-bound volumes suggested an institution built upon foundations of trust and tradition, making the recent revelations of financial impropriety seem all the more shocking. The examination of the parish accounts revealed a pattern of systematic deception that demonstrated both considerable cunning and increasing desperation. Mr. Blackwood had initially confined his activities to modest adjustments that might easily escape casual scrutiny, but his gambling debts had gradually forced him to more ambitious diversions that left increasingly obvious traces in the financial records. "The orphanage fund appears to have been particularly affected," Mrs. Clement observed, with growing horror as they reviewed the ledgers. "Nearly £40 collected over the past 2 years seems to have been redirected, with only token amounts actually reaching the children's home in Little Wickham." Miss Marple noted that this sum represented a considerable portion of the village's charitable giving, money that had been contributed by parishioners who trusted that their donations would reach those most in need. The betrayal of such trust struck her as particularly despicable, involving as it did the exploitation of genuine Christian charity for personal gain. "The Restoration Fund has suffered similar depredations," Mrs. Clement continued, her voice growing stronger as righteous indignation overcame her initial shock. "Money earmarked for urgent repairs to the church roof has apparently been diverted, leaving us unable to address pressing maintenance issues." The pattern that emerged from their examination revealed the gradual escalation of Mr. Blackwood's crimes, beginning with opportunistic theft from less carefully monitored funds, and progressing to systematic embezzlement from virtually every aspect of church finances. His position as treasurer had provided both access and authority, whilst his reputation for meticulous record-keeping had deflected suspicion from his increasingly elaborate deceptions. "I begin to understand Mrs. Hartwell's determination to expose these irregularities," Mrs. Clement remarked with growing respect for the deceased auditor's moral courage. The scale of the betrayal would have appalled anyone with a proper sense of Christian duty. Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Hartwell's forthright nature, whilst ultimately proving fatal, had been motivated by precisely the sort of moral clarity that such situations demanded. A refusal to compromise with dishonesty had made her a threat that Mr. Blackwood could no longer tolerate, transforming financial crime into homicide through the inexorable logic of desperation. The discovery of a hidden compartment within the treasurer's desk revealed additional evidence of Mr. Blackwood's systematic dishonesty. A collection of IOUs and promissory notes documented the full extent of his gambling debts, whilst a separate ledger recorded his frantic attempts to replace stolen funds through the anonymous donation scheme that had so puzzled Mrs. Foster. £23 in gambling debts, Mrs. Clement read from the concealed records with growing incredulity. And these appear to represent only the most recent obligations. The total amount may be considerably higher. Miss Marple observed that such substantial debts would have created overwhelming pressure for someone in Mr. Blackwood's position, particularly given his need to maintain the appearance of respectability within the close-knit village community. The anonymous donations had represented his attempt to buy time, whilst hoping that improved luck at the gaming tables might provide a more permanent solution to his difficulties. The timing of the donations corresponds precisely with Mrs. Hartwell's appointment as auditor, Mrs. Clement noted, consulting the dates recorded in the hidden ledger. It appears that Mr. Blackwood recognized the threat her investigation would represent and attempted to rectify the most obvious discrepancies before they could be discovered. This pattern confirmed Miss Marple's understanding of the psychological pressures that had driven Mr. Blackwood to increasingly desperate measures. His awareness that discovery was inevitable had transformed temporary expedients into permanent solutions, with Mrs. Hartwell's murder representing the final, irrevocable step in his descent from respectability to criminality. The examination of the church correspondence revealed additional evidence of Mr. Blackwood's growing desperation, including several letters from creditors demanding immediate payment and threatening legal action if their debts remained unsatisfied. The treasurer's position had become untenable, trapped between the demands of his gambling creditors and the approaching exposure of his financial crimes. I fear we must face the possibility that Mrs. Hartwell's death was not the only tragedy this affair may produce, Miss Marple observed quietly, reflecting that cornered individuals often proved capable of actions they would previously have considered unthinkable. Chapter 8. The Hidden Ledger. The afternoon had assumed that quality of hushed expectancy which Miss Marple had observed invariably preceded moments of dramatic revelation, rather like the peculiar stillness that settles upon a theatre audience in the moments before the final curtain rises upon the denouement of a particularly complex drama. Inspector Slack's motor car drew up before Rose Cottage, with the authoritative precision of official business conducted in earnest, and Miss Marple, observing from her drawing-room window, noted that the inspector's expression bore the satisfaction of someone who had at last assembled the scattered pieces of a particularly challenging puzzle. The inspector's knock possessed that particular quality of certainty which suggested he had come not to seek information, but to share intelligence of considerable importance. Miss Marple received him in her comfortable sitting-room, where the afternoon light fell upon chintz-covered chairs and the gentle accumulation of a lifetime's careful observation of human nature in all its fascinating complexity. Miss Marple, Inspector Slack began without preamble, his manner betraying the excitement of someone who had made discoveries of exceptional significance. I believe we have reached the conclusion of this most unfortunate affair. The search of Mr. Blackwood's cottage has yielded evidence that places his guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Miss Marple settled herself attentively, noting that Inspector Slack's confidence suggested discoveries that extended beyond mere circumstantial evidence. In her considerable experience, police officers adopted such definitive tones only when they possessed proof sufficient to satisfy even the most sceptical magistrate. Hidden within his study, concealed behind a false panel, that demonstrated considerable ingenuity, we discovered a ledger that documents the full extent of his financial crimes," Inspector Slack continued, consulting his notes with evident satisfaction. The records span nearly 4 years and detail embezzlement totaling over £60 from various church funds. This revelation confirmed the scope of Mr. Blackwood's systematic dishonesty, while simultaneously explaining the mounting pressure that had driven him to increasingly desperate measures. £60 represented a substantial sum for someone in his circumstances, sufficient to maintain the appearance of respectability, whilst concealing debts that would have ruined his standing within the community. The ledger includes detailed records of his gambling activities, Inspector Slack went on, with particular attention to debts owed to various individuals of questionable reputation in neighbouring towns. It appears that Mr. Blackwood had become involved with persons who employed rather direct methods of debt collection. Miss Marple reflected that such associations would have created pressures extending beyond mere financial embarrassment, introducing elements of physical danger that might well have driven a previously respectable man to contemplate actions he would never have considered under ordinary circumstances. The combination of approaching exposure and credible threats to his personal safety had created a situation in which murder might have appeared his only viable option. Most significantly, Inspector Slack continued with evident triumph, the ledger contained specific references to Mrs. Hartwell's investigation and his growing concern regarding the implications of her discoveries. The final entries, dated within days of the church bazaar, document his recognition that her audit would inevitably expose his crimes. This intelligence provided crucial insight into Mr. Blackwood's state of mind during the period immediately preceding Mrs. Hartwell's murder, demonstrating not merely opportunity and means, but the psychological pressures that had transformed financial desperation into homicidal intent. The ledger also reveals his method of acquiring the poison used in Mrs. Hartwell's murder, Inspector Slack added, his tone carrying the satisfaction of someone who had traced every aspect of the crime to its logical conclusion. Mr. Blackwood had been purchasing photographic chemicals in unusually large quantities, ostensibly for his hobby, but actually to extract cyanide for his deadly purpose. Miss Marple observed that this revelation confirmed Dr. Haydock's analysis of the poison used, while simultaneously demonstrating the careful planning that had preceded Mrs. Hartwell's death. The extraction of cyanide from photographic chemicals required both specialized knowledge and considerable preparation, indicating that Mr. Blackwood's crime had been methodically planned rather than committed in a moment of panic. His entries describe the process in disturbing detail, Inspector Slack continued, along with his careful study of Mrs. Hartwell's habits to ensure that she would be the sole victim of his poisoned cake. He had observed her fondness for sampling anonymous donations and calculated that her death would appear to be the result of tragic accident rather than deliberate murder. This intelligence struck Miss Marple as particularly chilling, demonstrating not merely criminal intent, but a cold-blooded calculation that seemed entirely at odds with Mr. Blackwood's previously established character. The transformation from respected church treasurer to calculating murderer illustrated the devastating effects of desperation upon previously moral individuals. The anonymous donations that had puzzled everyone were documented as his frantic attempts to replace stolen funds before Mrs. Hartwell's audit could reveal their absence, Inspector Slack explained. However, his gambling debts had grown beyond his capacity for restitution, making discovery inevitable regardless of his desperate efforts. Miss Marple reflected that Mr. Blackwood's situation had resembled that of her nephew's friend, who had attempted to conceal his examination failures through increasingly elaborate deceptions, each false success requiring further fabrications until the entire structure collapsed under its own impossibility. Financial crimes possessed a similar inexorable logic, with each theft necessitating further dishonesty until exposure became mathematically inevitable. The ledger reveals that he had been planning to flee the country immediately after the bazaar, Inspector Slack continued, using funds he had reserved for that purpose, whilst hoping that Mrs. Hartwell's death would delay the investigation sufficient to permit his escape. Passages to various colonial destinations had been researched, along with methods of establishing new identities in locations beyond the reach of British justice. This revelation confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that Mrs. Hartwell's murder had been motivated not merely by desperation, but by a comprehensive plan to escape the consequences of years of systematic dishonesty. Mr. Blackwood's crime had been calculated with the precision of someone who understood that half measures would prove insufficient to address his increasingly desperate circumstances. We apprehended Mr. Blackwood at his cottage as he was destroying remaining evidence of his crimes, Inspector Slack concluded with evident satisfaction. His reaction to our arrival removed any lingering doubts regarding his guilt, as he immediately confessed Mrs. Hartwell's murder, whilst pleading that his actions had been driven by circumstances beyond his control. Miss Marple observed that such immediate confession often characterized individuals who had reached the limits of their capacity to maintain elaborate deceptions, finding relief in finally acknowledging truths they could no longer conceal. The psychological burden of sustaining complex lies often proved as devastating as the original crimes that had necessitated such deception. His confession includes detailed descriptions of how he prepared the poisoned cake and arranged for its anonymous delivery to the parish hall, Inspector Slack added. He had studied Mrs. Hartwell's habits sufficiently to ensure that she would consume the fatal portion, whilst his position as church treasurer provided the access necessary to plant the evidence without arousing suspicion. The inspector's account confirmed Miss Marple's understanding of the careful planning that had preceded Mrs. Hartwell's death, while simultaneously revealing the cold calculation that had characterized Mr. Blackwood's approach to murder. His crime had been neither passionate nor impulsive, but rather the product of systematic analysis and methodical preparation. The recovery of the stolen funds appears unlikely, Inspector Slack concluded regretfully, as Mr. Blackwood's gambling debts had consumed virtually everything he had taken from the church accounts. The various charitable causes that depended upon those contributions will suffer considerably from his betrayal of their trust. Miss Marple reflected that this aspect of the tragedy might ultimately prove more devastating than Mrs. Hartwell's death itself, as the theft of charitable funds represented the betrayal of an entire community's faith in the fundamental decency of those entrusted with their generous contributions. Chapter 9. Confessions at Evensong. The evening service possessed that particular quality of solemn anticipation which Miss Marple had observed invariably accompanied moments when communities gathered to confront uncomfortable truths about their own nature. St. Mary Mead's ancient church, with its weathered stones and memorial tablets bearing witness to centuries of human folly and redemption, seemed to hold its breath as the congregation assembled for what many sensed would prove a most extraordinary evensong. Miss Marple, arriving with her customary punctuality, noted that attendance had swelled considerably beyond the usual faithful remnant who maintained the evening service as a bulwark against the increasing secularization of village life. Word had travelled, as word invariably did in communities where the distinction between private affairs and public interest remained delightfully nebulous, that Inspector Slack intended to conclude his investigation in a manner both dramatic and definitive. The inspector himself occupied a pew toward the rear of the nave, his presence lending an air of official gravity to proceedings that would normally concern themselves solely with matters spiritual. Miss Pemberton, her true identity now revealed to the parish, sat with the composed attention of someone whose professional duties had reached their intended conclusion, though her expression suggested that the resolution of this case had brought her little satisfaction. Mrs. Clement moved through her duties with the careful precision of someone determined to maintain proper forms, despite circumstances that threatened to overwhelm established proprieties. The vicar's wife had aged perceptibly in recent days, her face bearing the particular lines of strain that appeared when cherished illusions regarding human nature encountered harsh reality. Mr. Blackwood entered the church as the service commenced, flanked by two constables whose presence ensured that his participation in the evening's revelations would be neither voluntary nor subject to premature conclusion. His appearance shocked those who had known him as the epitome of respectable reliability, for his features bore the ravages of someone who had confronted the complete collapse of a carefully constructed life. The transformation was remarkable and deeply unsettling, rather like observing a portrait whose familiar features had been subtly altered to reveal previously hidden aspects of character. The measured dignity that had characterized Mr. Blackwood's public persona had given way to the haunted expression of someone who had discovered depths of desperation within himself that he had never suspected existed. Father Brown conducted the service with that particular gravity which churchmen employed when addressing congregations burdened by knowledge of sin within their midst. His sermon, drawn from texts concerning confession and redemption, seemed directed less toward general spiritual improvement than toward the specific circumstances that had brought them together on this extraordinary evening. "Dearly beloved," Father Brown intoned, his voice carrying clearly through the ancient stones, "we gather tonight in the presence of truths that challenge our understanding of those we believed we knew well. Let us remember that confession represents not merely acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but the first step toward that redemption which remains available to all who seek it with genuine contrition." Miss Marple observed that these words produced a visible effect upon Mr. Blackwood, whose carefully maintained composure finally began to crumble under the weight of circumstances he could no longer deny or deflect. The presence of his neighbours, people who had trusted him with their charitable contributions and regarded him as a pillar of community respectability, seemed to make his situation unbearably real. As the service progressed through its familiar rhythms of prayer and response, the tension within the ancient building became almost palpable. Those present understood that they were witnessing not merely the conclusion of a criminal investigation, but the complete destruction of assumptions that had underpinned their community's sense of security and trust. Inspector Slack rose during the period traditionally reserved for announcements and testimonies, his movement causing a subtle stirring throughout the congregation, as all present recognized that the moment of revelation had arrived. His expression bore the particular solemnity of someone charged with delivering truths that would prove both illuminating and devastating. "Members of this parish," Inspector Slack began, his voice carefully modulated to carry appropriate respect for the sacred setting, whilst maintaining the authority of his official position. "Recent events have revealed circumstances that require acknowledgement before this community can begin the process of healing and recovery." The inspector's preliminary remarks established the gravity of what was to follow, whilst allowing those present to prepare themselves for revelations that would challenge their fundamental assumptions about neighbours they had regarded with trust and affection. "Mr. Blackwood has confessed to the deliberate murder of Mrs. Prudence Hartwell," Inspector Slack announced, his words falling into a silence so complete that the settling of ancient timbers seemed thunderous by comparison. His confession includes detailed descriptions of how the crime was planned and executed, along with the motives that drove him to such desperate action. The effect of this announcement upon the congregation was immediate and profound, producing that particular quality of shocked silence which follows the confirmation of suspicions too dreadful to have been openly acknowledged. Several elderly parishioners required the ministrations of neighbours, whilst others sat in stunned contemplation of implications they were only beginning to comprehend. Mr. Blackwood himself appeared to shrink within his clothing, as though the public acknowledgment of his crimes had somehow diminished his physical presence, as well as his moral stature. When he finally spoke, his voice carried barely above a whisper, yet in the profound silence of the church, every word fell with devastating clarity. "I killed Mrs. Hartwell," he said simply, his confession possessing the stark honesty of someone who had finally abandoned all pretense. "I poisoned her with cyanide that I extracted from photographic chemicals, using my knowledge of her habits to ensure that she alone would consume the fatal cake." His words seemed to hang in the consecrated air like an admission of sin before the highest possible tribunal, whilst those present struggled to reconcile this confession with their memories of the man they had thought they knew. The transformation from respected neighbour to confessed murderer challenged their fundamental beliefs about the reliability of appearances and the predictability of human behaviour. "I had been stealing from the church accounts for nearly 4 years," Mr. Blackwood continued, his confession gaining momentum as though the act of acknowledgement had finally freed him from the burden of concealment. "Gambling debts drove me to increasingly desperate measures, whilst Mrs. Hartwell's investigation threatened to expose crimes that would have ruined me completely." Miss Marple observed that Mr. Blackwood's confession possessed the particular quality of relief, mixed with despair, that she had witnessed in other individuals who had finally abandoned the exhausting effort of maintaining elaborate deceptions. The psychological burden of sustaining complex lies often proved as devastating as the consequences of their eventual exposure. "My photography hobby provided both the means and the opportunity," he admitted with devastating honesty. "I had studied the properties of various chemicals sufficiently to extract cyanide from developing solutions, whilst my position as treasurer provided access to the parish hall where the poisoned cake could be planted among anonymous donations. The congregation listened with the horrified fascination of people confronting evidence of evil within their previously secure community, whilst Father Brown maintained the compassionate attention of a shepherd charged with ministering to both victims and perpetrators of human weakness." Chapter 10. Truth Served with Prayer. The weeks that followed Mr. Blackwood's confession possessed that peculiar quality of convalescence which Miss Marple had observed invariably accompanied communities recovering from profound shock to their fundamental assumptions about human nature. St. Mary Mead bore the appearance of a village attempting to heal wounds that extended far beyond the mere loss of one respected resident, encompassing as they did the complete destruction of trust in institutions and individuals previously regarded as beyond reproach. The immediate aftermath of the revelation had been managed with that particular combination of practical efficiency and emotional delicacy which characterized English village life at its most admirable. Mrs. Clement, despite her own distress at the betrayal of charitable trust, had coordinated efforts to assess the full extent of the financial damage, while simultaneously ensuring that the most vulnerable beneficiaries of church charity continued to receive necessary support. Miss Marple, observing these developments from her customary position as interested but unobtrusive neighbour, reflected that communities possessed remarkable resilience when confronted with evidence of individual moral failure. Rather like gardens that recovered from severe pruning by producing new growth more vigorous than before, St. Mary Mead had begun to demonstrate that collective virtue could survive and even flourish, despite the revelation of individual corruption. The financial audit conducted under Miss Pemberton's professional supervision had revealed the full scope of Mr. Blackwood's systematic embezzlement, while simultaneously uncovering irregularities that extended beyond his personal crimes. Years of casual record-keeping had created opportunities for confusion and error that, whilst not necessarily criminal in intent, had nonetheless compromised the effectiveness of charitable efforts. "It appears," Miss Pemberton reported to the emergency meeting of the Church Council, "that Mr. Blackwood's crimes, whilst deplorable, have had the inadvertent effect of exposing systemic weaknesses in our financial management that required attention regardless of his personal failings." Miss Marple found this observation particularly astute, reflecting that catastrophic events often serve to illuminate problems that might otherwise have remained hidden until they reached more serious proportions. The necessary response to Mr. Blackwood's betrayal had forced the parish to examine its procedures with unprecedented thoroughness, resulting in improvements that would benefit future charitable endeavours. The question of restitution had proved more complex than initially anticipated, as Mr. Blackwood's assets, whilst insufficient to compensate fully for his thefts, nonetheless provided partial recovery of the stolen funds. His cottage, modest savings, and various personal effects had been liquidated under court order, generating nearly £20 toward the replacement of embezzled charitable contributions. The irony, Mrs. Clement observed with that particular mixture of sadness and satisfaction, which characterized those who had witnessed justice imperfectly served, is that Mr. Blackwood's gambling debts consumed far more than he actually stole. His creditors will receive nothing, whilst the charitable causes he betrayed will recover at least a portion of what was taken from them. Miss Marple reflected that such outcomes often characterize cases where financial crimes were motivated by addiction, rather than simple greed. The compulsive gambler's relationship with money bore little resemblance to rational calculation, creating situations where elaborate crimes yielded benefits that proved both temporary and ultimately insufficient to address the underlying problems that had motivated the original theft. The community's response to the tragedy had revealed aspects of collective character that provided considerable cause for optimism regarding St. Mary Mead's capacity for recovery and renewal. Rather than allowing the revelation of Mr. Blackwood's crimes to undermine their commitment to charitable giving, parishioners had responded with increased generosity that more than compensated for the financial losses his embezzlement had created. The special collection taken during last Sunday's service exceeded our most optimistic expectations, Father Brown announced to the reconstituted church council. It appears that knowledge of how our charitable funds were misused has strengthened rather than weakened the community's determination to support those in genuine need. This response struck Miss Marple as entirely consistent with her understanding of human nature under circumstances of moral challenge. Communities often demonstrated their finest qualities when confronted with evidence of individual failure, responding to betrayal of trust with renewed commitment to the values that had been compromised. Miss Pemberton's revelation of her true identity and professional mission had been received with interest rather than resentment, as the parish recognized that her investigation had been motivated by genuine concern for the proper administration of charitable funds rather than mere curiosity about village affairs. Her musical qualifications, being entirely genuine, had enabled her to continue serving as church organist whilst the community adjusted to the knowledge of her professional background. "I confess," Miss Pemberton admitted during one of her conversations with Miss Marple, that my assignment to St. Mary Mead was initially regarded as something of a professional exile. However, the experience has reminded me why the Church's charitable mission requires protection from those who would exploit it for personal gain. Miss Marple observed that Miss Pemberton's work had served purposes beyond the mere detection of financial irregularities, demonstrating the effectiveness of professional oversight in maintaining the integrity of charitable institutions. The diocesan authorities had implemented similar monitoring procedures throughout the county, ensuring that Mr. Blackwood's crimes would not be easily replicated elsewhere. The question of Mr. Blackwood's ultimate fate had been resolved with that particular combination of justice and mercy which characterized the English legal system at its most thoughtful. His confession, complete cooperation with authorities, and evident remorse had resulted in a sentence that balanced the demands of punishment with recognition of the circumstances that had driven him to desperate action. 7 years imprisonment with the possibility of earlier release for good behaviour, Inspector Slack reported to those who had followed the case to its conclusion. The judge noted that whilst Mr. Blackwood's crimes were serious, his gambling addiction represented a form of mental affliction that warranted consideration alongside the more conventional factors in sentencing. Miss Marple reflected that such outcomes, whilst perhaps unsatisfying to those who preferred more dramatic forms of justice, often proved more effective in addressing the underlying causes of criminal behaviour than purely punitive approaches. Mr. Blackwood's imprisonment would provide opportunities for treatment of his gambling addiction, whilst ensuring that he could not repeat his crimes against other communities. The memorial service for Mrs. Hartwell had taken place on an October morning of exceptional beauty, with the autumn colours providing a fitting backdrop for the celebration of a life dedicated to accuracy, honesty, and the protection of charitable trust. The church had been filled to capacity with those who wished to honour her memory, whilst acknowledging the courage she had shown in pursuing truth, despite personal danger. Mrs. Hartwell died defending principles that form the foundation of civilized society, Father Brown had observed during his eulogy. Her commitment to financial honesty and charitable integrity cost her life, but her sacrifices ensured that the causes she sought to protect will continue to benefit from the generosity of those who share her values. Miss Marple, listening to these words while surrounded by neighbours who had been profoundly affected by recent events, reflected that Mrs. Hartwell's death, whilst tragic, had ultimately served to strengthen, rather than weaken, the community's commitment to the principles for which she had died. The revelation of Mr. Blackwood's crimes had demonstrated both the vulnerability of charitable institutions and the resilience of communities determined to protect them. As the service concluded and the congregation dispersed into the golden afternoon, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the complex patterns of human behaviour that she had observed throughout this extraordinary episode. Evil, she reflected, often produced consequences far beyond the intentions of those who committed it, creating ripples of change that sometimes strengthened rather than weakened the moral foundations of communities. The parish of St. Mary Mead would recover from this tragedy, as it had recovered from countless others throughout its long history, but it would emerge with a deeper understanding of both human frailty and human resilience, better equipped to recognize and respond to future challenges to its collective moral integrity.